Hello and welcome to the David Dwyer Experience. I'm your host, David Dwyer, and this vlog today will be about the impact of overfishing on our ocean. So you might think, well, I know that the oceans are in trouble, but fishing, what's the problem with fishing? People fish all the time, we eat fish. But that's where we're wrong. Overfishing is probably the greatest crisis that faces our ocean. And I would like to talk to you today about why that is and what we need to do to stop it. Our seas are beautiful, teeming with life. Over 80% of Earth's species are found in the global ocean. Same ocean that stretches here in Connecticut behind me all the way to Antarctica and across to China is all one giant body of water filled with life. Many people say that Africa is our universal home as a species. And while that's true for humanity, if we want to broaden the scope, in reality, you can say that all life on Earth, from the trees behind me to that bird there, to myself and you watching this video, all comes from the ocean behind me. It's our universal home. It's what every single life form on this planet has in common. And unfortunately, too many people aren't treating our home with enough respect. And we are on the verge of a global environmental collapse. And the ocean can and should be and will need to be our number one tool in combating this. As sea levels rise with global warming, water is going to encroach on some of the most valuable farmland in the world. And millions of people, we have 8 billion people on the planet right now, and we're going to have more by the time global sea levels rise. If we lose that farmland, billions of people will go hungry. So we need the ocean to be healthy in order for us as humanity to continue to have a sustainable food source that is ubiquitously found all around us. And the ocean needs to be used moving forward as our tool to combat all of this. However, in order to do that, we need to, and I mean need to, change our relationship with the ocean. Right now, we just take and take and take and take from the ocean. I recently watched a documentary called End of the Line, where we talk about overfishing. And in that documentary, they likened it to farming, how a farmer will only plow a field maybe once or twice a year, if that, to make sure that their field has a sustainable life giving in their soil. But with overfishing, you can equate it to a farmer, if a fisherman was a farmer, plowing the sea 7 or 8 times a year. Think about that. Think about how productive a field could be after a few years if you plow it 7 or 8 times a year. It'll be a desert. And unfortunately, a lot of parts of the world, like the Mediterranean, East Asia, and the North Atlantic, we're already seeing that. Fish species are going down. Communities that relied on fishing are having total economic collapses, and we need to do something about this. 1 billion people today's livelihoods revolve around fishing. About 800 million fishermen around the world go in every day, and it is their only source of money. Think about that. If we lose 8 million jobs because we're not responsible with our ocean, not only are we going to have an environmental collapse and a food collapse, we're going to have an economic collapse. And on top of that, 3 billion people rely on the sea as their primary source of food, especially in regards to protein. Think about that. 1 billion jobs, 3 billion empty bellies if we do not change our relationship with the ocean. Alright, so now that my whole dramatic bit by the ocean is done, and I'm not screaming over the wind, let me talk to you about my bias first. I love fishing. I fish just about every day if I can when I have free time. And I come from a family who's very, very strong in fishing. We have a big fishing tradition. My grandpa used to win cups for fishing in New Zealand. I know how to fly fish. I know how to deep sea fish. I surf fish. I fish in the Long Island Sound, the place where I was just recording at a few minutes ago, uh, more than just about anybody I know. So I come from an angle of a fisherman who fishes, and I need to talk about what we need to do to stop overfishing. And I love seafood. I eat tuna, salmon, cod, all these fish that are on the edge of population decline regularly. I've tried as of recent to really limit my consumption of endangered species, um, and to stop supporting fishing that doesn't uh, uh, align with global regulations on catching. But it's very difficult with seafood, as I'll get into, for sourcing it. You really need to find people who care about the ocean's well-being, because most corporations who manage seafood could care less. So, uh, like I also believe that like farmers, fishermen are crucial to the global economy, but have little respect in terms of what they do. They're so important, but we don't think about them very often. They're sort of thought of as uneducated workers who just go and be stinky all day, basically. And I think that a lot of the reason is because fishing, while it's so important, is a job that is controlled by really low rate wages, little regulation, and huge multinational corporations that sort of set prices on what they want to buy from fishermen. So fishermen who have a bad year, like a farmer, would need to sell the fish at a rate that the company sets, and because of that, they're poor. I mean, there's no other way getting around it. And a lot of times, big commercial vessels will come and troll their waters, and they will have, you know, absolutely no capacity to compete with that. And also, I don't want to see fishing go away. Like I said, I love fishing. It's an ancient art. It's one of the first things our ancestors learned how to do was fish. And until recently, our ancestors didn't really have an exploitative relationship with the sea. It was a take and a give relationship, and I don't want to see this ancient art go away, and I don't want to lose the opportunity for future generations to never experience what we experienced, to see the beauties under the waves, to see all the animals, and to experience the amazing flavors that come out of the ocean just because of a guilty, greedy few that live today. So, first, when researching this project, I figured the best way to start off was to talk about to talk to fishermen, to talk to people who know the daily life of catching fish. And because I fish regularly, I am in contact with quite a few fishermen. And the first person I think of was my grandfather, who passed 2 years ago. But I had a lot of conversations with him for years about his angle, his voice in this conversation. A man who has caught just about every single fish you could name: sport fishing, fly fishing, angler fishing, deep sea fishing. He's done it all: marlin, tuna, whatever, in New Zealand, in the United States, in Australia, in Europe. And while he definitely enjoyed doing this, and a big part of it was sport, he was a huge conservationist when it came to hunting and fishing and all the other things. in that sort of category. Uh, our region of New Zealand, where my family comes from, um, had in the late 20th centuries a huge crisis because the soil was being overused and there was droughts, and there was very little native uh, bush, which is jungle basically. In New Zealand, you call it bush, but our family's land still had some because there was a waterfall and about a few thousand acres of land that had never been touched was then gifted by my grandfather to the government of New Zealand to be used as a nature preserve, and it's still there today, and it's beautiful. If you ever go to New Zealand, you have to see it. And because of that, he also took this conservation angle when it came to the sea. He was very, very, very strict when we went out fishing to make sure that we measured everything correctly, that we had all the right licensing, and that we only caught the limit of what was allowed on that day. And that's really important to me now, too, as a fisherman, to follow that. So I also talked to my uncles and cousins a little bit in New Zealand over Facebook Messenger, and they basically said that they do the same thing. So then I talked to my stateside friends when it came to fishing, and people who mentored me on how to fish the waters of North America, like fly fishermen and all that. And one of my friends, Timon, who also used to live in my hometown, but now teaches people how to fly fish in New Hampshire, was telling me how even until very recently, there was a noticeable decline in trout populations in the local streams because of pollution and overfishing and people just taking without caring. So now he's also a local game warden, and he makes sure to prosecute strictly anyone who does not comply with local fishing regulations. Most other people I talked to in the U.S. Who I know through fishing in the Northeast basically said the same thing, that they really strongly agree with the regulations that we have in place. Because luckily, Connecticut and New England have some of the most robust fishing regulations in the country, which I'll get into later, because they need to. They need to. And then finally, I use this app called FishBrain, which is basically like Facebook for fishermen. And I put on my FishBrain account basically a poll on all these people are, really big fishermen, what they think about the local regulations for fishing. Like I said, Connecticut has very strict regulations. And the FishBrain poll showed that 72% of participants were in favor of current regulations in the state of Connecticut, where, like I said, fishing regulations are very robust. And two quotes, one for and one for against, show what really spoke out to me. So the first quote I want to read was, "While some years of regulation seem to be a huge pain in the ass, in regards to catch limit, they are absolutely necessary to ensure our kids and our kids' kids will be able to enjoy the fruits of the sea as we do today." And this was posted by Northeast Angler 203. And then the second quote, which was the only one that I saw openly against current fishing regulations with an interesting argument, other than just being lazy, is really spoke out to me and could be a sign of how we need to address our relationship with fishing licensing in regards to the economically disadvantaged. I get that overfishing is a problem, but the current system of licensing puts a barrier to entry on low-income people and limits what they can catch for dinner. And this was posted by Big Juan 96. So as I talk about solutions, keep in mind that I come from a background of privilege where buying equipment, buying fishing licensing, and catching fish is more of a hobby than a livelihood. So while I may advocate for this from an environmental perspective, also keep in mind the lens of people who may not be as economically advantaged and uh, use this as a livelihood. Although I will also get into why this is more the fault of corporations and less the fault of environmental regulations. So, first, I want to diagnose the problem. If it's not local fishermen who are in opposition to overfishing, or people who do it for sports fishermen, they usually tend to agree with the overfishing crisis. Then what is it? Well, I want to take you back 100 years ago to my home state of Connecticut, um, which used to be known as the whaling capital of the world. In fact, I'm wearing a Hartford Whalers jersey, a defunct hockey team whose name literally implies the exploitation of of marine mammals. So the Long Island Sound used to be teeming with whale life. Huge whales, sperm whales, blue whales, humpback whales. You could see them all the time, every day, because the waters of the Long Island Sound are very calm and very warm in the wintertime, which is good for whales. So, in the late 1800s, whale oil started to be used for lamps, and people realized how profitable that could be. While before, whaling was a very localized phenomena that usually people only used for food if they were in a time of famine, soon became a global phenomena where companies out of New England, specifically in Connecticut, would sail across the entire world hunting whale, just almost exclusively for their oil to be used in lamps. They didn't want to eat them because whale meat doesn't sell very well unless you're eating it for sashimi in Japan. Some cultures consider it a delicacy, but this is wasteful practice, mainly used for the oil in lamps. Professor Lisa T. Balance, a marine biologist at the University of Maine, said that the commercial hunting of whales in the early 20th century arguably represents the greatest wildlife exploitation event in history in terms of biomass. And the result of whale hunting and whaling have been catastrophic for the ocean community. It's ruined the ocean carbon cycle, and up to 95% of whale populations have been removed from the ocean completely, all for whale oil lamps. We don't even use whale oil anymore. And some whale populations are finding it very difficult to rebound. And unfortunately, we have little to no data on what the whale population should be. So it could be 95%, it could be more, it could be less. We don't know specifically because scientific data on marine populations hasn't really been studied until the late 20th century. So we don't know how bad the whales have been, but local conservation efforts and worldwide conservation efforts have slowly shown a couple whale populations to rebound. A moratorium was finally placed in 1986 to ban the commercial whaling industry around the world except for Aboriginal people in the Arctic. And the results, while not all perfect, have pointed to a better future for whales. The Long Island Sound, which had been extinct of whales for the past 50 years, is now starting to see a resurgence in whale population every couple of years. The whale population of the Sound increases by about 5%. So things are looking up. But that wasn't the case for fishing, which is still a huge problem. So by the 1950s, large-scale commercialization of fishing, like whaling, commenced. As after World War II, the oceans became much more safe, and the United Nations started implementing universal laws of the sea for fishermen that would basically allow vessels from any country to exploit the waters up to 100 miles off the coast of a certain country. Also, better technology and safer waters made this venture finally profitable for those who had the money to do so. Keyword, those who had the money to do so, to go out around the world and start trolling the bottom of the ocean for fish. For those who had the what was once a local business, fishing had always been local, and a localized problem soon became global. Before 1950, there was cases of overfishing, especially here in the North Atlantic. Cod populations had already been gone down. Atlantic salmon had become almost all but extinct in many rivers along the eastern seaboard. But that was a localized problem, and local solutions could solve it. Moratoriums could be placed locally on fishing, and it would go away. But now that it was a global phenomenon, the results became absolutely devastating and global. So I watched the End of the Line documentary by National Geographic, and I just want to read some notes about the impact of overfishing that has taken place since the 1950s globally. And conservative estimates place that 80% of fish population worldwide has decreased. And this was not known until the late 90s. One of the main reasons of this was China and Japan had been lying about the numbers of fish in their waters and how many they were catching for government statistics, basically to keep their jobs. They would lie about how many fishes they were catching. So as fishing production went up, it looked like for a while the world was being able to meet that demand. But once these officials were exposed, we realized that they were lying so much that it brought an increase of fishing globally to an absolute nosedive. And one of the places where this could be seen the most is in Newfoundland. So the island of Newfoundland, which is in the North Atlantic off the coast of Canada, had recently become absolutely devastated in the 90s due to overfishing. An island that had fed the world cod for hundreds of years had finally run out of cod. The North Atlantic cod's population had went down 99% in the last 100 years because of overfishing off the coast of Newfoundland. And the local economy, which was almost completely reliant on cod fishing, collapsed overnight, and the economy of Newfoundland has not recovered since. Today, cod populations in Newfoundland have not rebounded. A line was recently put at the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Newfoundland, and on one line, only one medium-sized cod and 3 undersized cod were caught in a region that used to be known for catching thousands of cod a day. But Newfoundland isn't the biggest issue. The biggest issue, I think, and End of the Line seems to agree, is trolling. An extremely wasteful and environmentally catastrophic practice where nets are being put at the bottom of the seafloor and dragging up absolutely everything. Fish, coral, plants, animals, dolphins, turtles, sharks, rays, whatever, and putting them into a net, strangling them, and then taking them onto the ship. And then whatever these big companies don't deem as valuable fish, they just throw back in the ocean, dead. They don't care. They don't care about the value of these animals or the well-being of the ecosystem that they rely on and they exploit. Up to 50% of animals caught in trolling nets are just thrown away. Sometimes even more, depending on what you're trolling for. In some waters, 80% of what is caught in a trolling net is just thrown back into the ocean. No regard for anything. And the majority of the time, these trolling nets kill absolutely everything that is in them. Also, because of because international global companies, mainly based in Europe and Japan, are allowed to fish just about anywhere in the world thanks to the UN laws of the sea, places like Africa, Polynesia, and other economically disadvantaged regions of the world are being exploited as local fishermen just cannot compete with these massive vessels that come in and take their fish and then leave them with nothing. Local fishing isn't the problem. If local fishermen were fishing their waters, they would be able to sustain their communities and sell some of the fish for a profit, and the health of the ocean would be fine. But since this isn't the case, it completely devastates local economies, especially in West Africa. And because of this, the European migrant crisis has ramped up as one of the largest groups of economically displaced individuals who travel to wealthier nations are fishermen. And it completely demolishes their local economy. They have to leave. They have to leave without their families often. And Pierre Diala of Senegal said on the End of the Line documentary, fish have a visa, but the fishermen do not. So these people who are already economically disadvantaged have to try and compete with global corporations, and it just simply does not work. In 2010, the World Wildlife Foundation calculated that 50%, up to 50% of the fish you eat today or every day was caught illegally in complete disregard of UN regulations on fishing or local regulations on fishing. And all of these, without exception, are usually bought by large seafood companies that do not care about sourcing of their seafood. And finally, when you have a depletion of all of these species in the ocean, what you end up seeing is species that generally don't have a problem, like jellyfish, worms, rays, shrimp, start to completely explode in population as their predators, the fish and the sharks and the dolphins that once kept their population in check, are dying. Jellyfish population since 1980 has exploded up to 500%. Many beaches in Asia and North America have had to close numerous days out of the year because the water is simply too jellyfish infested. Fish parasites, algae, worms are also exploding in population and are causing unseen environmental impacts on the world. So, with all of these problems, how are we going to fix it? Well, like I said earlier, in 1986, there was a moratorium finally placed on commercial whaling and a moratorium on cod fishing in 1993 in Newfoundland, much to the chagrin of the local population who relied on this resource to stay afloat. Also in the 90s, activism against overfishing finally started to become a little bit more mainstream. In fact, the famous song by Billy Joel, the Downeaster Alexa, brought highlight to the plight of local fishermen in the northeast region of the United States, Long Island, Cape Cod, Nantucket, Connecticut, and showed how the environmental catastrophe faced because of overfishing has left many, many communities along the coast of the Northeast completely economically decimated, and it's going to keep happening unless we do something about it. Also, by the early 2000s, a lot of more environmentally conscious restaurants and companies started to uh, produce lists and only deal with groups who sustainably source their fish. And I talked to a local seafood market in Greenwich, Connecticut called Fjord, who claims to only source the most sustainable seafood possible um, about what they had to say and why they did it. And what the person at Fjord told me was that they only deal with nations that tell the truth, have a relationship with all catchers and commercial growers, and make sure that they catch fish under the UN required regulations for sustainable populations. And this is just a first step. Also, many famous five-star restaurants, cooks like Bobby Flay have finally taken endangered fish like bluefin tuna off their menu, which is huge. It should have been done 20 years ago, but still huge. And more fish that are less sustainable. I mean, that are more sustainable, like shrimp, lobster, um, and sardines, anchovies, are starting to be eaten more, and the larger, less sustainable populations like cod, salmon, tuna are being eaten less, at least in some circles. Unfortunately, in other countries and in nice, wealthy establishments that could care less, tuna population is decreasing, but the consumption of tuna and salmon is at an all-time high. But with all that being said, countries who historically had relied on fishing as an institution to keep their economies afloat are starting to take the lead. And this is one of the rare cases where the United States actually takes a proactive approach ahead of other countries in regards to environmental health. The US, Canada, Norway, Australia, Iceland, New Zealand have been huge in combating the overfishing crisis in and around their waters with frequent patrols, Coast Guard patrols, and sustainable catch limits. Some of the best examples highlighted in the end of the line are Alaska and the Bahamas. Alaska, while not having many marine reserves, keeps fishing limits well below the sustainable population rate, and patrols their waters, spends more money patrolling their waters than any other state in the United States. And yet, they are still one of the largest seafood producers in the country. They just have to do it sustainably, and they have no issues. The Bahamas, on the other hand, and many other Caribbean countries, which you wouldn't think of as fishing or environmental juggernauts, have been some of the most proactive in promoting marine reserves, where fishing for anybody, locals included, is outright banned. And the results have been extraordinary. Fish populations had rebounded in the marine reserves by up to 150% in some Caribbean countries, according to the World Wildlife Foundation. Finally, New Zealand, a country that and it's no surprise that Alaska and New Zealand are two places that I fish and two places that I have had the best time fishing. New Zealand has always been a nation that's been at the forefront of environmental regulation and has been absolutely since the 70s regulating how much they can catch. They were the first country to ban commercial whaling. They do a patrol around their waters for East Asian, specifically Japanese vessels that come and try and whale and fish their waters, and they've done a very, very good job about it. Another huge, huge thing we need to do right now is to stop buying seafood that was caught by trolling, or just get the international community to ban trolling altogether. It just cannot go on. There is no way in the world that we can have trolling of the seafloor and continue to have the marine populations that we still have. Local fishing should be encouraged. It should be regulated and taken out of the hands of these huge multinational corporations like Mitsubishi, which you think of as an engineering company, is also the largest buyer of tuna in the world, and they set the price for people. If local fishermen were able to set their own prices and comply with regulations, then they wouldn't feel boxed into following these illegal practices of fishing, because they'd be compensated fairly for the work that they put in, which is, by the way, the second most dangerous job in the world, fishing, compared to even firefighters, police officers, EMTs, social workers. Fishing is much more dangerous. Loggers, just about any job in the world, fishing is more dangerous. Finally, I think that we should change our attitude to fish farming. You'd think that fish farming would be good, but in reality, it is actually, in a lot of cases, more harmful than beneficial for marine population, as 20% of fish caught in the world, 20%, is used as feed for fish farming, usually salmon, which is completely unsustainable. Instead of catching anchovies and sardines and small fish for fish farming, we could eat those fish and do it in a sustainable manner. But because people see salmon as such a luxury dish, they want to eat salmon, cod, and tuna. And there's so many. The ocean is full of 80% of the sea population, 80% of the animal population in the world, and the vast majority of these animals are edible, great sources of protein, and in a lot of ways are more humane than eating these huge fish, complex organisms, algae, sponges, invertebrates, all that have very, very basic components of life. They don't feel pain. They don't have brains. Would be much more humane than torturing these giant fish and catching turtles and dolphins and all that in the nets. So finally, now that you've heard all my data and my opinions about it and the positions of many other people, the final thing I want to leave you with is my solution. I think that we really, really need to take these huge multinational corporations out of the equation when it comes to fishing. Obviously, you need a good distribution chain worldwide to make fishing practical, but we need to make fishing more local, more in the hands of the people who are actually out in the sea collecting the fish, and not these big businessmen in metropolitan centers who eat endangered species every week and only care about profit. Also, I think that the world needs to come together uniformly and and take a stand against trolling. Those two things would be the biggest start in our global battle against overfishing. And I hope that with all the data, with my opinion, with the opinion of others, you can come to a conclusion with me against overfishing and to come together and solve this problem as humanity, which is what we need to do. Otherwise, we are going to have one of the biggest problems in the world. Thank you.